So, hello and welcome to everybody joining us for this book launch of Riding the Populist Wave, Europe's Mainstream Right in Crisis, which is being hosted here at Queen Mary University by the Mile End Institute. We're here to talk about this book, if you can see it, as I'm parading it in front of the camera, with myself as one of the co-editors, and also my co-editor, Cristobal Rovira Calvasa, who's joining us all the way from Chile, where he is Professor of Political Science at the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago de Chile. And he is also, and I must remember to say this, Associate Researcher of the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies. So there, got that in. We're also being joined very kindly by two great comparative political scientists who are particular experts on populism, the populist radical right. The first is Professor Sarah de Lange, who is professor by special appointment, I think it's by special appointment, at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. And since 2016, she's held the Dr. J.M. Den Uyl Chair, the chair established by the Beardy Beckman Foundation. Thanks very much for joining us, Sarah. And from a little bit nearer, Paul Taggart from the University of Sussex. He is the former editor of the Journal of Government and Opposition and is now chair of the board of governors for Government Opposition, which is a really great journal. Paul's also the author of one of the kind of classic seminal texts on populism. He was talking about populism before anyone else was even thinking about populism. So we're really glad to have him along too. And I thought what we do is start off by asking Cristobal to talk for a few minutes, 5-7 minutes or so, about the book. He's got some slides. We're hoping that all works. And there goes my doorbell. And then we will throw it over to Sarah and then to Paul, and then we'll just sort of kick around some of the themes of the book. And we plan to finish up around 2 o'clock. So if you're thinking of delaying your lunch and wondering whether you'll be able to eat, then you should be able to tuck in around 2. So Cristobal, I'll hand over to you.
Excellent. Many thanks, Tim. And I hope that everybody can look now at the small power presentation that I have prepared. So as Tim mentioned, I want to do a very, very brief introduction to the main ideas of the book that you can see here. And my presentation, it's mainly 4 slides. I will talk about the point of departure of this book project. I will talk briefly about the research gap. I will also mention something about the conceptual framework that we developed here, and finally, the theoretical framework. So before I start with that, let me emphasize something. This is an edited volume. So if you think that the ideas that we develop here are brilliant, this is mainly because of Tim, who is not presenting, but also because we have several scholars that have written very, very good chapters. So this is a collective endeavor. So, and most of the ideas that I will present here, we have been discussing them with Tim, but also with the other people that are part of this book project. So, said that, let me go to the first point, and this is the point of departure. So we open up our book presenting the electoral results of mainstream right-wing parties across Western Europe for the last 4 decades. And these are the average, of course, there are differences across countries, but overall, I think there are a couple of issues that are relevant if we look at that graph. The first issue is that populist radical right parties, so this is the red lines, are going slowly up, but it's not a very dramatic trend. Of course, in some countries it's different, but on average, this party family goes from 9% of average to approximately 14% of average. If you look at the other party families that we analyze in our book project, the liberal party family is pretty stable. Conservative parties are going down, but slowly. And the most dramatic is Christian democracy, which is the yellow one. If you see here, it goes from roughly 25% of the vote to 15% of the vote. And this shows that mainstream right parties are struggling to adapt to the contemporary scenario, particularly Christian democratic parties, and in a second step, so to say, conservative party family, and the liberal, again, it's relatively stable. So this is, again, the point of departure, if you want, of our book project. So about the research gap, what we emphasize in our book is we have very, very little comparative research about these different party families. Of course, we have very good analysis of mainstream right parties in individual countries. For example, everybody knows that Tim is probably the expert of the Conservative Party in the UK, but we almost don't have its books or papers are analyzing different mainstream right parties across Western European countries. So why do we have this research gap? And we think there are two important reasons here. The first one, and this is a criticism to myself, but for most scholars, I would say, there is an ideological bias. I think that most of us tend to sympathize with social democratic parties or with green parties. And because of that, we either analyze them or we analyze the populist radical right, which is the party family that we hate. But we put very little emphasis on the mainstream right, so to say. There is a second argument that it's not an ideological one, and it's related to the graph that I presented before. Declining electoral support for the mainstream right, it has been a slow motion process, quite different with what has happened with the Social Democratic Party family. And I think because of that, many of us have simply forgotten that many of these mainstream right parties are suffering today or are in a very difficult situation. Having said that, what we try to do in our edited volume is to address this research gap. And we do that by combining two large case studies, one on the demand side, another one on the supply side, and at the same time by inviting scholars from different countries that have written very good chapters on 8 different countries that you can see here. And we try to put different countries that shows the differences within Western Europe. So we have Northern Europe, Southern Europe, but we excluded on purpose, so to say, Eastern Europe, just to have some coherence within the Western European countries. And of course, one of the crucial questions that probably we can debate in the Q&A is to what extent the ideas that we develop here travel beyond the Western European context, for example, to Eastern Europe, but also talking from Latin America or even to the United States. So what about the conceptual framework that we developed? I don't want to explain that very briefly, so I hope that people will got interest that then they will look at the book. But mainly what we say is we start in a very simple way to defining the right using the classical approach of Norberto Bobbio. Based on that, then we say we need to make a distinction between two very big party families within the Western European context, and this is the mainstream right versus the far right. And we develop here a couple of ideas of how to make the distinction. And based on that, we go one step down in the ladder of abstraction following Sartori's argument, and we distinguish 3 different party families within the mainstream right. And we try to argue why these are examples of the mainstream right, and this is Christian Democratic Party family. Classic example will be the CDU in Germany. The Liberal Party family, a classic example will be the project of Emmanuel Macron in France, and the Conservative Party family, the classic example will be the Conservative Party in the UK. And also we identify the far right, and here we, following a long tradition of studies, we say we can identify again 2 different party families within that block, and this is a populist radical right, such as the Lega Nord in Italy, and the extreme right, such as Golden Dawn in Greece. So finally, what about the theoretical framework that we develop in our book? What we try to say is mainstream right parties, and by mainstream right parties, we're talking about the Liberal Party family, Christian Democratic Party family, and the Conservative Party family, are experiencing a tension that it's becoming quite problematic for them. And this is a tension between, on the one hand, what we call the silent revolution, following the classic argument of Ronald Inglehart, who argues that because of the very successful economic modernization process that Western European societies have experienced in the last 3 to 4 decades, voters have slowly becoming much more progressive. And this is what he calls a silent revolution. And it's a silent revolution because it's a slow motion process that has been taking over a couple of decades. But at the same time, following the argument of Pierre Ignacy, we argue that there is a so-called silent revolution. And this means that there is a small fraction of the electorate across Western European societies who don't feel very comfortable with the silent revolution. And this is why they try to politicize the authoritarian and nativist ideas that are very familiar with the project of the populist radical right and the extreme right. Finally, we say also that if we want to understand how these 2 revolutions translate into policy challenges, there are many different ones, but we say there are 4 that are particularly problematic for the mainstream right. And these are the European integration project, immigration, of course, moral issues, and the welfare state. And the different chapters in our book try to analyze which of these different policy areas are more problematic than others. And I will just stop by saying this, and then happy to hear the comments of Sarah and Paul about the overall idea of our project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cristobal. Great slides, as usual. I do apologise, just before Cristobal started talking, my doorbell did go. You may have heard me refer to that. It wasn't, as Professor Dan Huff from Sussex University WhatsApped me to ask Tesco with my grocery delivery. It was, in fact, Oxford University Press. He obviously got wind of the fact that we were launching a Cambridge University Press book and decided to time their delivery just to hit this particular Zoom seminar. So apologies for that. Anyway, without more ado, Sarah, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for introducing me, and congratulations, Cristobal and Tim, as well as all your co-authors on what is probably the most timely volume ever published. So you're launching your book today, and yesterday, and I'll quote, yesterday the Politico Europe published a long read that headlined "The Party's Over for Europe Centre-Right. Amid election losses and scandal, Europe's once preeminent political family is suddenly adrift." So I don't think volumes become more timely than yours. And I think it's also a very accomplished volume. First of all, because it does focus on the mainstream right, and you're absolutely right. It's a group of political parties that does not receive its fair share of scholarly attention. Also because it has this really nice theoretical puzzle around the silent revolution and silent counter-revolution, and the way that these two parallel processes create tensions or dilemmas for mainstream right parties. And of course, because it has such a nice combination of large end studies, both demand and supply side, and some great country chapters. And the country chapters are really diverse and map onto the different kinds of party systems that and variations of the mainstream right that we have in Western Europe. So they can teach us a lot about the variety that we find on the right. And that immediately brings me to my first point I would like to make. Because Cristobal said, well, I think there are probably two reasons as to why the mainstream right doesn't get researched that much. It's the ideological bias of scholars, and it is the gradualness of the decline of the mainstream right. I think there are other reasons why this group of parties is understudied. First of all, because the mainstream right is so fragmented. As you rightly point out in the book, there's three main party families: Christian Democrats, conservatives, liberals. And that is a very different picture than on the mainstream left. Because if we talk about the mainstream left, we actually talk about social democratic parties. We do not include green parties. We consider them niche or new politics parties. And we do not include the radical left, which we study in the same way as we study the radical right. So studying three party families that have distinct ideologies, distinct electorates, as one group within our party systems is complicated by nature, I think. I also think that there's substantive reasons as to why social democrats have attracted attention earlier on. I think this has to do with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It has to do with this notion of the end of ideology. It has to do with the third way, which was such a significant ideological development that the party family attracted attention. And we haven't seen similar, deep developments in terms of ideology on the mainstream right. And I would be very interesting to hear whether you agree with me on this point, or whether you think communitarianism, Etzioni-based ideology is a significant development that has taken place on the mainstream right in past years. And I also think that a third reason is that the mainstream right looks so different across different party systems. right? So we have countries like Austria that only has one main mainstream right party, a Christian democratic one. Then we have Germany next door, which has, you know, a very similar party system in terms of number of parties, but it has a Christian democratic party and a liberal party. And if we move one country over to the Netherlands, the mainstream right looks completely different in terms of its structure. Again, not to mention the Scandinavian countries. So it's far more difficult to compare between countries when you're discussing the mainstream right than when you're discussing the mainstream left, I think. The second point I would like to make is whether it's productive to study responses to populism and the populist radical right in terms of left and right. So we have a whole bunch of scholarship now on the mainstream left's response. You're adding to that by studying the mainstream right. But if you take your book and you compare it to the scholarship that's out there on the mainstream left, then what stands out is how much Christian Democrats have in common with Social Democrats in terms of their demise, the extent of it, in terms of the underlying dilemmas. So I'm increasingly beginning to think that it could be more productive to take these old mass parties that originate from the age of universal suffrage that have very similar roots and historical developments, to take these together and study what's happening to them, because I think it will enable us to see factors that we don't see if we take this left-right perspective. Focus more on the nature of the mass party as an organization, for example. Focus more on what it means to have been governing and have had government responsibilities for decades and decades and decades. So I think that we're missing certain factors by looking at this in terms of left and right. Then the third point I would like to briefly make is this a book about a response to populism? It's called Riding the Populist Wave, but it's actually very much in terms of the dilemmas you sketch about the emergence of second dimension politics, about the rise of social cultural oppositions in politics, which has very little to do with populism, right? It's about substantive politics. It's about the nativism of populist radical right parties, for example. So my question to you is, what is the populism doing in this development on the mainstream right? And what triggered me here is that I think we do observe also a different way in which populist parties on the right approach mainstream right parties. So yes, populism entails a narrative of a conspiracy of elites from different ideological tenets. The Front National always talked about la bande de quatre, so all four main parties which it's opposed. Thierry Baudet in the Netherlands speaks of the party cartel. But at the same time, we often observe that populist radical right parties target the left far more than they target the mainstream right? So they talk about the left-wing church, because they do have to cooperate if they want to have influence with mainstream right parties, right? This is fundamentally different. So what does that mean for the role of populism in all of this? And then lastly, the biggest question that remains unanswered for me at the end of the book, and this is also very much informed by Dutch politics, which is fascinating when you look at the mainstream right, is how can we account for the many cases in which we see that both the populist radical right is thriving, as is the mainstream right party, right? We see this in the Netherlands, where the PVV is the second largest party, and the VVD of Prime Minister Rutte is still, after this very, very long period of government responsibility, the largest. But we also see this in a similar way in some Scandinavian countries, where both manage to thrive at the same time, which makes it difficult to argue that this is about the cooptation of immigration issues, etc. Because then you would expect that there would be some degree of communicating vessels in terms of support going on. So I would very much like to hear your ideas on that puzzle.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We can certainly discuss some of those. Fascinating to hear that Politico have been talking about this crisis of the centre-right. There was an interesting article as well in the New Statesman, I think recently, about the German elections, and we can talk a little bit about that. There was a reaction on the part of one of the writers of the New Statesman asking whether sort of conservatism in general was in big trouble across the world and not just in Europe. So thanks for your remarks about the timely nature of the book. It's always good to hear that. Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much, Sarah. That's really interesting. I've changed what I'm going to say now. I haven't heard what you said. I want to make 4, I think, quite simple points. As you can imagine, I've been asked to talk in a book launch about this book, so I'm going to say some nice things about it. But I mean this one, which is the simple point that, and this I changed a little bit in light of what Sarah said. I think the point of this book is that it shows that studying party families on their own as discrete columns and as unencumbered by interactions with other party families is problematic. And I think that's the great strength of this book, which is it is deliberately saying to understand the centre-right, we have to understand the populist radical right. And as Sarah's implying, actually, to some extent, I think you have to look more broadly across the party system. So I think it's the great strength of this book, that it's trying to break down those distinctions. And the map that Christa, Bale and Tim provide of the right seems kind of, it's a classic academic thing of, that seems obvious now you say it. I don't know who else says that in terms of the right. That's great. Revelations that you thought you always knew, but you didn't know before someone say it, always proof of the pudding for me. So the first thing I'd say is I think that the great asset of this book is it does that, it deals with that interaction. It's more complex than just the populist radical right and the centre right, but it's still interesting. And I'm very interested about those comments about why the centre right has been neglected. And I think Sarah added to that very nicely. The second point I'd make is just an observation about terminology, which is about the mainstream right. It's interesting that populism is bigger on the title than the mainstream right, but that's a side point. I think it's interesting that there's a more movability about what constitutes is it the centre? Is it the mainstream? Is it the establishment? And Jonathan Hopkins yesterday was at a seminar saying, "Oh, well, when did the Social Democrats become the centre left?" I thought it was a really interesting comment. When did the right become the centre right? And why did these categories exist? And I think that I'm going to mix my metaphors here. There's a sort of Overton window that has moved about what's acceptable, how we define the centre, the mainstream. I think this particularly is a response to the populist, one element of populism, which is bashing the establishment. The established right would be another term for that. But the very fact we problematize, we as academics are changing the terminology, I think it shows the influence of populism in general. And for me, I always think that what's interesting is the distinction between those who attack the actors within the system, the existing parties, those who attack the system itself, and those who go even further and attack the idea of politics. And historically, the first two of those have been meshed. The emergence of anti-system parties was about parties that opposed democracy, but also didn't like the people that were exercising the democracy. But what we've had more recently is, I think, parties that emerge that don't like the establishment, don't like the establishment parties, but are accepting democracy. They might do it different ways, they accept it, but actually are appealing to a real hostility towards politics in general, I think. And that's what's unsettling for politics. So my point is very simply that it's interesting how we move the terms that we're talking about. And I think that reflects something that's going on underneath, below the surface. Third point is one related very much to the findings of the book. As Sarah said, there are some fantastic, nice case studies here that give very, very different stories, and they're really valuable in their own right. You can read these chapters if you're interested in the particular countries and get really great stories. But putting them together, it shows to me that the issues that Christa, Bale and Tim pick out in terms of the framework, the problematic issues for the mainstream right it's interesting that they're immigration, Europe, moral issues and welfare. And at least three of those are highly fungible issues to me. that we talk in generalities across Europe, but immigration means something very different in different contexts to different people in those same contexts, whether it's opposed, what the reasons you're opposed to immigration or what sort of immigration you're opposed to. I think there's a danger that we tend to say that is an issue, but actually it's a highly differentiated set of issues. So that doesn't help the book, as it were, but I think it explains why the narrative in the country stones are often really quite different, that what look like the similar concepts, similar issues, are spelled out in different ways. And my last point is this: I'm a man of a certain age, so I like dad rock. Tim's laughing because he's almost the same age as me. So, you know, you can guess what sort of music I like, right? I like kind of guitar-based melodic music with harmonies. I like the idea of the LPs. You sit down and listen to it all. And you know, we'll ask generation again, we're waiting for it to come round again. You know, they'll realise that eventually guitar music will come back into fashion, and so on, and we'll get back to LPs. But I remember seeing this old rocker saying, I think actually that's not going to happen. The really weird period was the period of kind of classic rock. That's just bizarre. And we're never going to go back there. I think the same thing applies. I think very often when we're looking at parties and party systems, we keep going, when will it get back to the stability of the centre right and the centre left? But the bizarre period in terms of politics is that really strange European mid-post-war period, mid-century post-war period, when there was stability. What was bizarre was that ever existed. The reality of actually atomized and of highly fragmented of political systems with parties changing and mutating very quickly is actually the established norm of party politics. And actually, we're moving into a period of normal party politics from a period of abnormal party politics. And I think, in a way, that's what this book shows you.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, Paul is 16 days older than me, so everything he said clearly applies. I'm not even sure I can call him a centrist dad now, because obviously the center of gravity for centrism and centrist dadism was probably changed, given what he said about terminology. Again, I thought there were some really interesting points there. And the last point for me, I think is a really interesting one. I think it is actually quite difficult, both, you know, kind of almost kind of emotionally as well as academically, for some of us to conceive of the fact that, you know, the kind of flux that we are currently living in is what it is, you know, and that actually we're not going to return to this, you know, what some people may see as a kind of golden age of stability that was perhaps to some extent, you know, framed by the Cold War. And obviously, you know, you can see in a country like Italy, the end of the Cold War causes the collapse of the party system. In some ways, it was very easy for us to point to Italy, particularly in this country, because of course we always kind of saw Italy as a bit of a basket case, lots of parties, you know, things changing all the time, although actually there was stability underneath. But actually, perhaps, you know, what we're seeing in some ways is sort of Italy in slow motion for the rest of the rest of Europe. In some ways, you know, polarization, fragmentation, not a complete collapse of the party system, but certainly a huge change in that. And even obviously from where you know, Sarah comes, the Netherlands. I mean, that was always quite a fragmented system, but now, I mean, it really does take fragmentation and to some extent polarization to new limits. But presumably, even in the Netherlands, there might be some limit to how many parties you can get in Parliament. But who knows? So some really good questions there. I mean, just to address one point that Sarah made, I'll kick off by addressing that, and then maybe Chris Darwin might want to talk about some of the others. I actually do think you make a really good point when you say that, you know, I wonder whether our kind of obsession with this dividing line between left and right and analysing politics, you know, according to, you know, that dividing line in particular, it is as fruitful as perhaps it was. Maybe this will be the last ever book on the centre right. And, you know, you make a good point that it is perhaps, you know, now a better idea, you know, as we move on to talking about catch-all parties more generally, and look at what's happened to those parties and the challenges that they face together. It's interesting. I went for the first time, went anywhere actually in 18 months to Munich last week to a conference convened by the foundation of the CSU in Bavaria, and it was using precisely that framing. What challenges does populism pose to catch-all parties, both of the left and the right? And actually, that was quite a fruitful way of looking at it, I thought. I should say, by the way, it was obviously also very interesting being in Germany just after the election. Caused me to look a little bit deeper into the German election than I might otherwise have done, obviously. And although I obviously need to be careful about saying this, because I think the book is saying something still very relevant about the challenge that the populist radical right poses to centre-right parties, but also perhaps centre-left parties. Coming back to Sarah's point, if you look at the flow of the vote in Germany, it's fascinating, because the CDU-CSU, who were the losers, if you like, of the election, Angela Merkel's party, at least the CDU, they actually lost more votes to the Grim Reaper, to death, than they did to the AfD, the populist radical right party in that country. And in fact, they lost far more to the Greens as well. And of course, the biggest loss, as far as they were concerned, was to the Social Democrats themselves. So it's still very sexy, if I can use that word, to talk about populism and the populist radical right, but it's perhaps a little bit too easy for us and for parties in the centre to worry about what's going on their kind of extreme flank, as it were, and take their eye off the ball and forget that most of the votes they're going to lose still, actually, in many cases, are going to be to their mainstream rivals, whether it be on the centre right or the centre left. So I think Germany is an interesting case study. It's one that we cover there, and there are some good reasons perhaps why the populist radical right's traction in Germany is always going to be perhaps a little less than it is in other countries. And it's also, I think, true to say that there's an extent to which, as Cristobal was showing in the graph, what happened to Christian democracy in Germany was in some ways an accident waiting to happen. The Christian Democrats in Germany had been very fortunate in picking two iconic leaders, one after the other, in Kohl and Merkel, and once those went, in other words, once the supply of exceptional leaders dried up, then it was going to be in as much trouble perhaps as some of the Christian democratic parties in other countries. So I think that the sort of separation of the centre right that we do, although I think it is valuable to study the centre right as a whole, I think it is quite useful to sort of pass out Christian democracy and conservatism and liberalism as well. And one more point before I go to Cristobal on Sarah's question about ideological development on the centre right. I mean, I think there has been some. I think actually the UK is a very, very interesting case study to look at here, and there's a really good chapter by Richard Hayton, who is a real expert on the Conservative Party. Thanks very much, Cristobal, for saying I'm the expert, but there are other experts are available, and one of them is Richard Hayton, and he writes a really good chapter on the Conservative Party there. What we're seeing at the moment, really, in some ways, is the Conservative Party totally changing the model of political economy that we've been very used to from the Conservative Party for a very long time, since the 1980s, with Boris Johnson moving towards, what some people would see as a much more, centrist economic programme, at the same time as becoming, rather more authoritarian, nationalist and nativist on the sort of social and cultural side. politics. So we are seeing development, but of course it might actually be a return to the kind of conservatism we saw in the UK before Margaret Thatcher. But anyway, Cristobal, any responses?
Thank you. I mean, these are brilliant reflections by both Sarah and Paul. So I just want to say a couple of ideas based on the sort of discussions that you have raised. I mean, Sarah mentioned, this is interesting, there are probably much more or any other reasons why scholars have not analyzed the mainstream right so far. And you were saying that one of the arguments that you put forward, that it's an interesting one, is you look at the Social Democratic Party family, it's different because of the end of communism, the end of Cold War, and and also the third wave, and this makes like a completely different scenario than if we compare that to the mainstream right. And just to add on that, I would say that one issue that in theory could explain that it's neoliberalism. That's a big revolution, so to say that it's very important for the mainstream right. But our chapters show that this might be relevant only for the UK. I mean, Thatcher has been the only case study in which you really see the neoliberal revolution being implemented. In the other mainstream right parties in Western Europe, of course, they are much more in favor of the market, but they haven't bought the whole argument about the neoliberal revolution. I mean, even if you look at the PP in Spain or the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, they tend to be pro-welfare, of course, much less than the Social Democratic Party family. But again, the neoliberal revolution, at least in comparison to the US and the UK, didn't arrive with such a vigor, so to say, for the mainstream right parties. And I think this is something interesting that pops up in many of the chapters of our edited volume. And the second aspect that I think it matters particularly for Christian Democratic Party family, it's what I will call this over-pragmatism. And what I'm thinking here is something that we emphasize with Tim is that the Christian Democratic Party family is obsessed with the office-seeking dimension. They really want to get into power. And if you want to get into power, you compromise a lot of other things, for example, your own policy dimensions. And this is very clear. For example, if you look at the German election now, probably if you ask any German, what the hell did the Christian Democratic Party want? They will say, get into power. Of course, that's nice. But which are the policy proposals? And I think it's not very clear. And this is something that have been saying other scholars as well. Jan Bernard Müller, for example, it's very clear on that, saying this argument that the Christian Democratic Party is dying because it doesn't have any ideology anymore. It's just adapt, and what they really want to do is to govern. And they say, we can offer stability. And as Paul is saying, probably stability is over. But this is how they try to relate to the voting public, but there is no a clear ideological profile. And on the top of that, because society is changing, I mean, religious values matter today much less than before, etc. This is one of the reasons why the Christian Democratic Party in particular is suffering in the contemporary situation. Related to the P word, so to what extent it's populism relevant or not, I think you are right that this is an ongoing debate for party scholars, that nativism, of course, is the key issue when we think about the tension between the populist radical right and the mainstream right. But nevertheless, I think the P word matters as well. And I will just want to flag two issues in which we can see that. The first one is when we present our categories of how we identify these different parties, and we say, okay, this is a mainstream right, and this is a far right, and within each of them, we have these different party families. One of the issues that we want to emphasize with this book is that if we buy the argument of that sort of conceptual framework, we need to be very careful when applying that. I'm saying that because we tend to assume that if a Christian Democratic Party is a Christian Democratic one, it will stay like this his whole life. And if we identify a populist radical right party, it will stay like this its whole life. And I think this is wrong. We need to empirically prove that. If we go to Eastern Europe, it's very clear that Fidesz at the beginning was a mainstream right party, and today it's not anymore. If we go to the United States, very clear that the Republican Party is anything but a mainstream right party now. And we tend to assume that this is not the case in Western Europe, but I think we need to be careful with that. I mean, Sarah's talking from the Netherlands, and then you have a liberal party that is getting extremely nativist. The obvious question is probably today still a mainstream right party, but there is a moment in which scholars need to really think, does really work, this idea that this is still a mainstream right party was moving into the other direction. And this is why I think the P word is relevant, because what some of these mainstream right parties are doing, and this is what we call in our book, it's an ersatz version of the populist radical right. They start to imitate them, try to take some of these ideas and also some of the populism that these parties develop. I mean, Tim knows it very well for the case of the UK. And this is, I think, that the P words bring something to the debate. And the last point, that this is also related to the P word, but it's also a bit related to this argument about that Sarah was developing about those fascinating cases in which it seems like both the mainstream right and the populist radical right is doing relatively well. And you're pointing out the Netherlands would be an example of some cases in Scandinavia. My feeling, and this is just a feeling, I cannot prove it, but my feeling is that this might work in the short and midterm, but I think in the long term is a killer. And this is also one of the arguments that we try to develop with Tim in our book. And the reason for that is in those places in which you see a sort of development that both parties, the mainstream right and the populist radical right, are winning. This is related to the fact that they have a sort of division of labor, that one part is a very nasty one, so really politicized issues related to nativism, and the other one is slowly adapting to that sort of scenario. It's saying, okay, we buy some of the argument, but not the full package. And I think that that strategy might work in the short term and the midterm, but I think in the long term, what might happen is that some of those who support the mainstream right, at the end of the day, might go out because they will say, okay, this party is moving too much to the direction of the populist radical right, and it's not my home party anymore. So, for example, the chapter by Elko Hartfeld on the demand side, he shows very clearly that those who support mainstream right parties across Western Europe tend to be well-off citizens, which in general tend to be much more on the post-material side than the material side, so to say. And this is why if you alienate those voters, it might be that those voters end up going to another party family. And this is probably what happened a bit in the case of Germany. And with this I finish, it might be that this cooperation between these parties is successful now, but I have doubts whether this is going to be a stable development in 10 or 15 years. But of course, we need to see what will happen in the couple of few years then.
Thanks very much, Cristóbal. We've got one question come in, which I think we could actually throw open because it's one that's often asked. I'm not going to answer it. Perhaps I should as the co-editor of the book, but I think it might be an interesting one actually for Sarah or Paul to pick up because you're both actually not limited in your work to studies of Western Europe and Eastern Europe. So Matthew Schlachter, and sorry if I've got the pronunciation wrong there, says, why do you make a distinction between West and East Europe? The dynamics seem to be similar in many Central and Eastern European democracies as well. I mean, just broadening that out then, perhaps Sarah first and then Paul, is it tenable anymore to limit what we do to one side of Europe or another, or really, should we abandon that and be talking about Europe as a whole, doing everything as scholars in a pan-European fashion? Sarah?
I think it really depends on the question you're trying to answer and the kinds of factors that you expect to play a role. So your book is very oriented towards arguments about the structure of the electorate in terms of their attitudes and the relation to their background characteristics and to party positions and the competitions that follow from that. And of course, we know that the structure of the party system in terms of this two-dimensionality that we've been discussing is different in Central and Eastern Europe compared to Western Europe. So that makes comparisons, I think, complicated. You can do it, but then you really need to explain how those two party spaces look like in the two different parts of Europe. And of course, I think any time that you're dealing with party politics, there's also, of course, the issue of party institutionalization. And we just discussed, that this is an element that pops up when we're discussing what's happening to Christian democratic and social democratic parties, this very long, century-long trajectory where parties have gone through all kinds of different phases in terms of their development. I mean, the situation in Central and Eastern Europe in that respect is fundamentally different. Parties are still relatively young, at least compared to these party families. And also as organizations are not always as institutionalized as parties in Western Europe.
Thank you very much. Paul, I'm going to get you to address that, but there's also another question coming, which I think, is relevant to what you do as well, relevant to the book. Kevin Ryan asked, to what degree, if any, has 21st century EU enlargement driven change in voter preference and the populist wave in Europe? And obviously, you do a lot of work on Euroscepticism. You're one of the kings of Euroscepticism in the UK. That's not a description of Paul's political views. That's a description of Paul's academic interests. So, Paul, two for you really on this question of whether to go pan-European, and also on the influence of EU enlargement on voting and populism.
Well, I think I'll deal with both questions if I can. I'll deal with the Western versus Eastern thing first. I mean, my instinct is always to be pan-European, but more in a sense of curiosity. I mean, the answer is surely it's horses for courses, as Sarah's implying. It depends what sort of question you're asking, and if you want to hold the cases to be quite similar, then Western Europe's a good starting place. I mean, the obvious point is volume 2 of this is clearly the pan-European comparison, extending this out and looking more seriously. I think that you do have models there of the centre right, perhaps what you call populist right as well in some cases, actually showing where the mainstream right can end up in Fidesz and Law and Justice, especially with Law and Justice essentially economically left wing and morally and socially right wing, and a very effective strategy in both cases for almost, I'm not going to push it too far, but almost making themselves hegemonic parties in their party system. So the models of success for Western Europe perhaps lie not in Western Europe, but more broadly elsewhere. So I think that's a really good way to go in the long term. But I do accept that there are very different kind of, in terms of getting your head around the comparisons, it's easier to have a smaller set of cases. And for the book, I find it easier to deal with a smaller set of cases for once. On the concept of has enlargement changed voter values across Central and Eastern Europe and across Europe in general? I mean, firstly, you have a convergence in some senses, as you'd expect. That's the whole point of the European project, is to for those who advocate it, is to create convergence and to create kind of normalization around those norms. But what strikes me is that when we look at, for instance, Euroscepticism, that the basis and the framing of Euroscepticism in Central and Eastern European states is often quite different, often different values, opposition to liberalism as a social value, rather than opposition to economic liberalism that you'd see in Western Europe. So the paradox is that yes, you've seen the growth of Euroscepticism across Europe, but in quite a differentiated way. And I suspect that the way that the developments in Central and Eastern Europe that I observe, I'm not a specialist in those in any respect, both in respect of where the future of the centre-right lies and the future of directions of Euroscepticism, it probably lies in the directions in Central and Eastern Europe rather than what's happening in Western Europe.
That's really interesting. I mean, just to sort of tag on to the point about Euroscepticism, one of the things that Tarek Abuchali and Werner Kraus do in the chapter is look at how the positions of these parties on various issues, we've already talked about them, have changed over time, over the last 30 years. And what is interesting is that actually, when we're talking about mainstream right parties anyway, they haven't become much more Eurosceptic in their positions over time in order to, as it were, cope with the rise of Euroscepticism, even in some Western European countries, and a more Eurosceptic agenda pushed by some of these populist radical right parties. There's a very big difference, for example, between the way that they have moved on immigration in particular. You can see a very, very clear correlation between the rise of radical right wing parties on the one hand and moves on the part of mainstream right parties to tighten their stances on immigration. And you certainly don't see that when you come to attitudes to the EU. And of course, without dragging it back once again to the UK, I do wonder whether, in fact, Brexit has in some ways done for extreme Euroscepticism in Europe, or at least any tendency on the part of the mainstream right to drift in a more Eurosceptic direction, and certainly towards any kind of exit. Looking as I say last week in Germany, and Sarah may confirm this for living on continental Europe and visiting Scandinavia as well. There's a certain degree of kind of bewilderment as well as kind of Schadenfreude, looking at the shortages that we've faced in this country recently. I thought Paul's point as well about the models for success for the mainstream right, possibly being in Central and Eastern Europe was really interesting. I mean, I think it's the case that in the UK, quite serious commentators, people who write for the Guardian, if you regard that as a serious newspaper, I do, are talking about Fidesz and law and justice in the same breath as they're talking about the Boris Johnson Conservative government. Because if you look at what that Conservative government is doing to, roll back or at least undermine, the capacity of the judiciary to interfere in politics as they see it, if you look at what it's doing to undermine the independence of the Electoral Commission, if you look at what it's doing in terms of introducing voter ID, which will make it much more difficult for people who tend not to vote Conservative, the young and the poor, to actually get out and vote. If you look at all sorts of things, you could see that these are to some extent at least if not inspired by some of the things that have gone on in Hungary and Poland. And it was very noticeable in Liz Truss's, who's the new Foreign Secretary's, big speech at the Conservative Party conference. She didn't mention Europe at all, didn't mention the EU at all. What she did mention was the Visegrad Four, of which Hungary and Poland make up two. So there is some nervousness, I think, on the part of liberal commentators in the UK that they are following that pattern, and certainly there was quite a lot of anxiety when Boris Johnson welcomed Viktor Orban to Downing Street. So that's just my 2 pence there. We've also got a question from Beckett McGrath about, first past the post and the electoral system. Cristobal, we didn't actually find, did we, that the electoral system as an institution made very much difference in any of our case studies, or comparatively as a whole?
Well, I mean, we had also this discussion, I remember, because we had a workshop. The book was written before the pandemic, so we had the great opportunity of get together, sit down 2 days in London and discuss each other. There was this whole argument about whether institutions really matter or not. And the overall idea that we had in our discussions, but also if you read the book, is institutions are relevant, but not that crucial. And in fact, this tension between the silent revolution and silent counter-revolution, you can observe that in the Netherlands or in Germany, countries that have a completely different electoral system than Spain and the UK. So this is why we think that institutions, of course, matter in the sense of first past the post system, but probably matters when it comes to addressing the issue, so to say, the tension. But the tension is already there. It doesn't matter which sort of institutions are regulating the political system. And probably it offers different opportunities of how to solve the crisis. And of course, the movement of the Conservative Party, it's different because of this electoral system that it would be, for example, in the Netherlands. But again, I think the tension, it's already there. And if I may say something in the last 2-3 minutes before someone also points out something, I just want to make 2 comments. One is about this issue of European enlargement and whether this explains the populist wave. And I think that we can go even one step further if we think in comparative terms, even beyond Europe. And this is an argument that I think IR scholars are putting forward, is that the expansion of non-majoritarian decision-making processes, it's one of the main reasons of why the populist wave is affecting all countries of the world. And I think EU enlargement is probably the clearest example of that. But we have nowadays democracies that are much less powerful because international institutions are more powerful. And because of that, it generates anger within certain sectors of the population. And this is one of the explanations of why populism is getting so relevant across the different countries of the world. And I think this is a crucial aspect that we need to put much more emphasis that, again, I think goes beyond Europe. And the second point that I wanted to make is about this issue of model of success. Paul was saying, okay, one option is like looking at Eastern Europe, but maybe there is another option. And this is the one that points out the chapter on France, that it's an interest developing of Macron. I mean, Macron, it's a brand new party, and it's a very peculiar phenomenon that it's a liberal party that combines the economic dimension of liberalism, but also the cultural dimension. And this is exactly the opposite of the adopting the populist radical right approach, is saying, no, we are going to be a mainstream right party, but we are going to be right-wing in the two senses, in the economic sense, but in the cultural one, we stick to the liberal values. We will see what happens with the elections in France, but let's imagine for a second that Macron is able to win a second term and to establish itself. I mean, France is a big country within Western Europe. It shows a way that in theory, other parties can try to imitate. And this would show, again, I'm just talking out of the blue, but this would show that the Liberal Party family might have something that can cope with this tension between the silent revolution and the silent counter-revolution in a much better way than, for example, Christian Democratic Party families. And this is probably also related to the story of the Liberal Party family. I think the Liberal Party family, to a certain extent, started to lose traction because of the expansion of liberal values. But if the liberal values are in tension nowadays, it could be that it has a revival. But again, it's an open question. I think France will probably show what will happen there.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to actually go to Sarah for the kind of the last question I was going to ask, because it actually is about the Netherlands and the extent to which you think that the VVD, the Liberal Party there, you know, the party of Prime Minister Mark Rutte, you know, still deserves the name Liberal Party, despite the fact, you know, that from the outside, some of what it says and does, particularly obviously on immigration and integration, doesn't sound very liberal. Is that a kind of permanent move, if you like, on the part of the VVD, or you know, is that just Mark Rutte?
Well, I think this is a very interesting question in light of what Cristobal has just outlined. When we study party families, we distinguish a number of established party families. And we've always had a number of liberal parties that we can't really classify. And I'm not speaking of the VVD, which is usually classified as liberal, but I'm most notably speaking of the D66 in the Netherlands. So we don't have any kinds of special issues or edited values on social liberalism. Even though social liberal parties like D66 or Radikale Venstre in Denmark, and I would put Macron in the same category, are becoming increasingly important. Important electorally because they obtain more support, but also important in the sense that they are a bridge between the left and the right in terms of voter flows, but also in terms of government formation. So in countries like the Netherlands and Denmark, these parties can ally themselves with the right on socioeconomic issues, but also with the left on social cultural issues. So I think their role is really increasing in our party systems. And if there's ever to be a follow-up on this book, I think a special focus on social liberal parties would be very interesting.
Okay.
It's all as a start to say that we have a social liberal party in the Netherlands, but we of course also have a conservative liberal party. And I think Dutch experts have labeled the VVD as conservative liberal already since the 1990s. It was Frits Bolkestein, former European commissioner, who already in the 1990s, when in the Netherlands there wasn't a successful populist radical right party yet, introduced identity and immigration as key issues for the party. So I see this as part of the conservative identity of the party. And I think that in that respect, the party is actually quite close to the Tories in the UK in how it sees itself, defines its issues, and takes stances on these issues. in rhetoric, the party has, of course, also moved towards the populist radical right on these issues, but also in terms of its populism, right? So Prime Minister Rutte is famous for shouting in Parliament, act normally, but then in a very streetwise manner, and other kinds of claims that show that he's trying to appeal to ordinary citizens. I think there's one way in which his movement is very different from the populist radical right. Of course, the populist radical right in many respects is quite ideological, right? There's strong underpinnings on the stances they take with respect to immigration and integration and other kinds of issues. And Rutte actually shares the over-pragmatism that Cristobal describes with the Christian Democrats, because he rejects ideology. He doesn't find ideology productive for leading a government. So I'm very curious to see what will happen to his party in the long run, whether he will suffer from the same kinds of problems as Christian Democratic parties, or whether he has found an alternative model to Macron's one that can also be successful within the new configuration of West European politics.
Oh, really interesting. I mean, we can also draw parallels there perhaps with Boris Johnson as well, in terms of his, commitment to kind of pragmatism to the point of opportunism, some people would say. Right, well, we've got to 2 o'clock. We could carry on talking for ages, but I would really like to thank Cristobal, obviously, coming all the way from Chile, Sarah, our guests, and Paul Taggart as well at Sussex University. I should also issue an apology to Paul, because earlier I said that he was 16 days older than me. He is, in fact, 16 days younger than me. So it's not just his rigorous moisturizing regime that makes him look so fresh compared to myself. It is the fact that he's 2 weeks younger than myself. So apologies, Paul. You can send either of us a birthday card sometime in November if you wish. But until then, I'd like to thank all of you for attending the launch event. Do have a look at the book. I hope you enjoy it. And thanks also to Sofia Casano, who is our producer at the Meyer Lennon Institute. And if you're interested in any of the events that we do at the Meyer Lennon Institute, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we've got a website, we're everywhere. So go and check out some of our events. We do all sorts of podcasts and video stuff as well. Thanks very much for coming, and see you all another time.